while I am talking, I'm conscious of what I say, I'm conscious of myself, yet only to a certain extent. Quite a lot of things happen. For instance, I make gestures. I'm not conscious of them. They happen unconsciously. You can see them. I may say or use words, and I can't remember at all having used those words, or even at the moment I'm not conscious of them. So any amount of unconscious things occur in my conscious condition. I'm never wholly conscious of myself. While I'm trying, for instance, to elaborate an argument, at the same time, there are unconscious processes that continue, perhaps a dream which I had last night. Or a part of myself thinks of God knows what, or of a trip I'm going to take, or of such and such people I have seen, or when I'm at writing a paper, I'm continuing writing that paper in my mind without knowing it. You can discover these things, say, in dreams, or if you are clever in immediate observation of an individual, then you see in the gestures or in the expression in the face that there is what one calls une arrière-pensée, something behind consciousness, so that you have finally the feeling, well, that man has something up his sleeve. And you can even ask him now, what are you really thinking of? You're thinking all the time something else, yet he's not conscious of it. Or he may be. There are, of course, great individual differences. There are individuals who have amazing knowledge of themselves, of the things that go on in themselves. But even those people wouldn't be capable of knowing what is going on in their unconscious. For instance, they are not conscious of the fact that while they live a conscious life, all the time a myth is played in the unconscious. A myth that extends over centuries. Namely, archetypal ideas, a stream of archetypal ideas that goes on through one individual, through the centuries. You see, it is like a continuous stream, and that comes then to the daylight in the great movements.
In his essay, The Transcendent Function, Carl Jung explores the complex relationship between the conscious and unconscious minds, which often hold conflicting contents and tendencies. He argues that the unconscious behaves in a compensatory manner towards the conscious to create psychic balance, and that bringing the unconscious contents into dialogue with the conscious mind is critical for psychological health and development. Suppressing the unconscious, on the other hand, leads to neurosis. Jung points out that dreams are the most readily accessible expression of the unconscious, but some people can also access it through spontaneous fantasies, visions, automatic writing, or creative activities like drawing and painting. He introduces the concept of the transcendent function, which is the process of consciously engaging with the unconscious material, shaping it, and understanding it. This process facilitates a transition from one psychological attitude to another. According to Jung, there are two main approaches to working with unconscious content: creative formulation, giving them aesthetic shape, and understanding the meaning. Ideally, both should occur. He also emphasizes that in relation to the unconscious, the ego's position must be maintained as equally valid to the unconscious contents, and that the confrontation must be thorough, with both sides taken seriously. The transcendent function manifests as the living third thing that emerges from the tension of opposites, consciousness and the unconscious. It leads to a new level of being and psychological wholeness. Engaging the transcendent function empowers the individual to attain liberation through their own efforts rather than depending on the analyst, and provides the courage to be oneself. These are just some of the core ideas from Carl Jung's essay, The Transcendent Function, which you will soon listen to. Now I invite you to leap into the unconscious ocean and let the words of Jung himself guide and embrace you. I recommend going to a quiet and comfortable place and allowing yourself to relax and open your mind. If it's the first time you're watching an Irevelato video, welcome. Here we unveil the wisdom of history's luminaries. Subscribe if you want to join us in our attempt to elevate our minds. If you are already part of Irevelato, thank you for joining us again, dear friend. Remember that every like, share and comment helps us spread the word far and wide. Also, if you wish to contribute to Irevelato further, you will find details about our Patreon and affiliate links in the description. No matter what you choose, you are always welcome on this channel to discuss the things that are on your mind. Thank you for listening so far. Now, without further ado, here is Carl Jung's The Transcendent Function. There is nothing mysterious or metaphysical about the term transcendent function. It means a psychological function comparable in its way to a mathematical function of the same name, which is a function of real and imaginary numbers. The psychological transcendent function arises from the union of conscious and unconscious contents. Experience in analytical psychology has amply shown that the conscious and the unconscious seldom agree as to their contents and their tendencies. This lack of parallelism is not just accidental or purposeless, but is due to the fact that the unconscious behaves in a compensatory or complementary manner towards the conscious. We can also put it the other way around and say that the conscious behaves in a complementary manner towards the unconscious. The reasons for this relationship are: 1. Consciousness possesses a threshold intensity that its contents must have attained so that all elements that are too weak remain in the unconscious. 2. Consciousness, because of its directed functions, exercises an inhibition which Freud calls censorship on all incompatible material, with the result that it sinks into the unconscious. 3. Consciousness constitutes the momentary process of adaptation, whereas the unconscious contains not only all the forgotten material of the individual's own past, but all the inherited behavior traces constituting the structure of the mind. 4. The unconscious contains all the fantasy combinations that have not yet attained the threshold intensity, but which over time and under suitable conditions will enter the light of consciousness. This readily explains the complementary attitude of the unconscious towards the conscious. The definiteness and directedness of the conscious mind are qualities that have been acquired relatively late in the history of the human race, and are, for instance, largely lacking among primitives today. These qualities are often impaired in the neurotic patient, who differs from the normal person in that his threshold of consciousness gets shifted more easily. In other words, the partition between conscious and unconscious is much more permeable. The psychotic, on the other hand, is under the direct influence of the unconscious. The definiteness and directedness of the conscious mind are extremely important acquisitions that humanity has bought at a very heavy sacrifice, and which in turn have rendered humanity the highest service. Without them, science, technology, and civilization would be impossible, for they all presuppose the reliable continuity and directedness of the conscious process. For the statesman, doctor, and engineer, as well as for the simplest laborer, these qualities are absolutely indispensable. We may say in general that social worthlessness increases to the degree that these qualities are impaired by the unconscious. Great artists and others distinguished by creative gifts are, of course, exceptions to this rule. The very advantage that such individuals enjoy consists precisely in the permeability of the partition separating the conscious and the unconscious. But for those professions and social activities that require just this continuity and reliability, these exceptional human beings are, as a rule, of little value. It is therefore understandable, and even necessary, that in each individual, the psychic process should be as stable and definite as possible, since the exigencies of life demand it. But this involves a certain disadvantage. The quality of directedness makes for the inhibition or exclusion of all those psychic elements that appear to be, or really are, incompatible with it, That is, likely to bias the intended direction to suit their purpose, and so lead to an undesired goal. But how do we know that the concurrent psychic material is incompatible? We know it by an act of judgment which determines the direction of the path that is chosen and desired. This judgment is partial and prejudiced since it chooses one particular possibility at the cost of all the others. The judgment in its turn is always based on experience, that is, on what is already known. As a rule, it is never based on what is new, what is still unknown, and what under certain conditions might considerably enrich the directed process. It is evident that it cannot be, for the very reason that the unconscious contents are excluded from consciousness. Through such acts of judgment, the directed process necessarily becomes one-sided, even though the rational judgment may appear many-sided and unprejudiced. The very rationality of the judgment may even be the worst prejudice, since we call reasonable what appears reasonable to us. What appears to us unreasonable is therefore doomed to be excluded because of its irrational character. It may really be irrational, but may equally well merely appear irrational without actually being so when seen from another standpoint. One-sidedness is an unavoidable and necessary characteristic of the directed process, for direction implies one-sidedness. It is an advantage and a drawback at the same time. Even when no outwardly visible drawback seems to be present, there is always an equally pronounced counterposition in the unconscious, unless it happens to be the ideal case, where all the psychic components are tending in one and the same direction. This possibility cannot be disputed in theory, but in practice it very rarely happens. The counterposition in the unconscious is not dangerous so long as it does not possess any high energy value. But if the tension increases as a result of too great one-sidedness, the counter-tendency breaks through into consciousness, usually just at the moment when it is most important to maintain the conscious direction. Thus, the speaker makes a slip of the tongue just when he particularly wishes not to say anything stupid. This moment is critical because it possesses a high-energy tension which, when the unconscious is already charged, may easily spark and release the unconscious content. Civilized life today demands concentrated, directed conscious functioning, and this entails the risk of a considerable dissociation from the unconscious. The further we are able to remove ourselves from the unconscious through directed functioning, the more readily a powerful counterposition can build up in the unconscious. And when this breaks out, it may have disagreeable consequences. Analysis has given us a profound insight into the importance of unconscious influences, and we have learned so much from this for our practical life that we deem it unwise to expect an elimination or standstill of the unconscious after the so-called completion of the treatment. Many patients, obscurely recognizing this state of affairs, have great difficulty in deciding to give up the analysis, although both they and the analyst find the feeling of dependency irksome. Often they are afraid to risk standing on their own feet, because they know from experience that the unconscious can intervene again and again in their lives in a disturbing and apparently unpredictable manner. It was formerly assumed that patients were ready to cope with normal life as soon as they had acquired enough practical self-knowledge to understand their own dreams. Experience has shown, however, that even professional analysts, who might be expected to have mastered the art of dream interpretation, often capitulate before their own dreams and have to call on the help of a colleague. If even one who purports to be an expert in the method proves unable to interpret his own dreams satisfactorily, how much less can this be expected of the patient? Freud's hope that the unconscious could be exhausted has not been fulfilled. Dream life and intrusions from the unconscious continue, mutalis mutandis, unimpeded. There is a widespread prejudice that analysis is something like a cure, to which one submits for a time and is then discharged healed. That is a layman's error left over from the early days of psychoanalysis. Analytical treatment could be described as a readjustment of the psychological attitude achieved with the help of the doctor. Naturally, this newly won attitude, which is better suited to the inner and outer conditions, can last a considerable time, but there are very few cases where a single cure is permanently successful. It is true that medical optimism has never stinted itself of publicity and has always been able to report definitive cures. We must, however, not let ourselves be deceived by the all-too-human attitude of the practitioner, but should always remember that the life of the unconscious goes on and continually produces problematic situations. There is no need for pessimism. We have seen too many excellent results achieved with good luck and honest work for that. But this need not prevent us from recognizing that analysis is no once-and-for-all cure. It is no more, at first, than a more or less thorough readjustment. No change is unconditionally valid over a long time. Life has always to be tackled anew. There are, of course, extremely durable collective attitudes that permit the solution of typical conflicts. A collective attitude enables the individual to fit into society without friction, since it acts upon him like any other condition of life. But the patient's difficulty consists precisely in the fact that his individual problem cannot be fitted without friction into a collective norm. It requires the solution of an individual conflict if the whole of his personality is to remain viable. No rational solution can do justice to this task, and there is absolutely no collective norm that could replace an individual solution without loss. The new attitude gained in the course of analysis tends sooner or later to become inadequate in one way or another, and necessarily so because the constant flow of life again and again demands fresh adaptation. Adaptation is never achieved once and for all. One might certainly demand analysis that it should enable the patient to gain new orientations in later life too, without undue difficulty. And experience shows that this is true up to a point. We often find that patients who have gone through a thorough analysis have considerably less difficulty with new adjustments later on. Nevertheless, these difficulties prove to be fairly frequent and may at times be really troublesome. That is why even patients who have had a thorough analysis often turn to their old analyst for help at some later period. In the light of medical practice in general, there is nothing very unusual about this, but it does contradict a certain misplaced enthusiasm on the part of the therapist, as well as the view that analysis constitutes a unique cure. In the last resort, it is highly improbable that there could ever be a therapy that got rid of all difficulties. Man needs difficulties. They are necessary for health. What concerns us here is only an excessive amount of them. The basic question for the therapist is not how to get rid of the momentary difficulty, but how future difficulties may be successfully countered. The question is, what kind of mental and moral attitude is it necessary to have towards the disturbing influences of the unconscious? And how can it be conveyed to the patient? The answer obviously consists in getting rid of the separation between conscious and unconscious. This cannot be done by condemning the contents of the unconscious in a one-sided way, but rather by recognizing their significance in compensating the one-sidedness of consciousness and by taking this significance into account. The tendencies of the conscious and the unconscious are the two factors that together make up the transcendent function. It is called transcendent because it makes the transition from one attitude to another organically possible without loss of the unconscious. The constructive or synthetic method of treatment presupposes insights that are at least potentially present in the patient and can therefore be made conscious. If the analyst knows nothing of these potentialities, he cannot help the patient to develop them either. Unless the analyst and patient together devote proper scientific study to this problem, which as a rule is out of the question. In actual practice, therefore, the suitably trained analyst mediates the transcendent function for the patient, that is, helps him to bring the conscious and unconscious together and so arrive at a new attitude. In this function of the analyst lies one of the many important meanings of the transference. The patient clings by means of the transference to the person who seems to promise him a renewal of attitude. Through it, he seeks this change, which is vital to him, even though he may not be conscious of doing so. For the patient, therefore, the analyst has the character of an indispensable figure absolutely necessary for life. However infantile this dependence may appear to be, it expresses an extremely important demand which, if disappointed, often turns to bitter hatred of the analyst. It is therefore important to know what this demand concealed in the transference is really aiming at. There is a tendency to understand it in the reductive sense only, as an erotic, infantile fantasy. But that would mean taking this fantasy, which is usually concerned with the parents, literally, as though the patient, or rather his unconscious, still had the expectations the child once had towards the parents. Outwardly, it still is the same expectation of the child for the help and protection of the parents. But in the meantime, the child has become an adult, and what was normal for a child is improper in an adult. It has become a metaphorical expression of the not consciously realized need for help in a crisis. Historically, it is correct to explain the erotic character of the transference in terms of the infantile eros. But in that way, the meaning and purpose of the transference are not understood, and its interpretation as an infantile sexual fantasy leads away from the real problem. The understanding of the transference is to be sought not in its historical antecedents, but in its purpose. The one-sided reductive explanation becomes in the end nonsensical, especially when absolutely nothing new comes out of it except the increased resistance of the patient. The sense of boredom that then appears in the analysis is simply an expression of the monotony and poverty of ideas, not of the unconscious, as is sometimes supposed, but of the analyst, who does not understand that these fantasies should not be taken merely in a concretistic reductive sense, but rather in a constructive one. When this is realized, the standstill is often overcome in a single stroke. Constructive treatment of the unconscious, that is, the question of meaning and purpose, paves the way for the patient's insight into that process which I call the transcendent function. It may not be superfluous at this point to say a few words about the frequently heard objection that the constructive method is simply suggestion. The method is based rather on evaluating the symbol, that is, dream image or fantasy, not semiotically as a sign for elementary instinctual processes, but symbolically in the true sense, the word symbol being taken to mean the best possible expression for a complex fact not yet clearly apprehended by consciousness. Through reductive analysis of this expression, nothing is gained but a clearer view of the elements originally composing it. And though I would not deny that increased insight into these elements may have its advantages, it nevertheless bypasses the question of purpose. Dissolution of the symbol at this stage of analysis is therefore a mistake. To begin with, however, the method for working out the complex meaning suggested by the symbol is the same as in reductive analysis. The associations of the patient are obtained, and as a rule, they are plentiful enough to be used in the synthetic method. Here again, they are evaluated not semiotically, but symbolically. The question we must ask is, to what meaning do the individual associations A, B, and C point when taken in conjunction with the manifest dream content? An unmarried woman patient dreamt that someone gave her a wonderful, richly ornamented antique sword dug up out of a tumulus. In this case, there was no need for any supplementary analogies on the part of the analyst. The patient's associations provided all that was necessary. It might be objected that this treatment of the dream involves suggestion, but this ignores the fact that a suggestion is never accepted without an inner readiness for it. Or, if after great insistence it is accepted, it is immediately lost again. A suggestion that is accepted for any length of time always presupposes a marked psychological readiness, which is merely brought into play by the so-called suggestion. This objection is therefore thoughtless and credits suggestion with a magical power it in no way possesses. Otherwise, suggestion therapy would have an enormous effect and would render analytical procedures quite superfluous. But this is far from being the case. Furthermore, the charge of suggestion does not take account of the fact that the patient's own associations point to the cultural significance of the sword. After this digression, let us return to the question of the transcendent function. We have seen that during treatment, the transcendent function is, in a sense, an artificial product because it is largely supported by the analyst. But if the patient is to stand on his own feet, he must not depend permanently on outside help. The interpretation of dreams would be an ideal method for synthesizing conscious and unconscious data. But in practice, the difficulties of analyzing one's own dreams are too great. Associations. Her father's dagger, which he once flashed in the sun in front of her, it made a great impression on her. Her father was in every respect an energetic, strong-willed man with an impetuous temperament and adventurous in love affairs. A Celtic bronze sword, The patient is proud of her Celtic ancestry. The Celts are full of temperament, impetuous and passionate. The ornamentation has a mysterious look about it, ancient tradition, runes, signs of ancient wisdom, ancient civilizations, heritage of mankind brought to light again out of the grave. Analytical interpretation. The patient has a pronounced father complex and a rich tissue of sexual fantasies about her father, whom she lost early. She always put herself in her mother's place, although with strong resistance towards her father. She has never been able to accept a man like her father, and has therefore chosen weakly neurotic men against her will. Also in the analysis, violent resistance towards the physician father. The dream digs up her wish for her father's weapon. The rest is clear. In theory, this would immediately point to a phallic fantasy. Constructive interpretation. It is as if the patient needed such a weapon. Her father had the weapon. He was energetic, lived accordingly, and also took upon himself the difficulties inherent in his temperament. Therefore, though living a passionate, exciting life, he was not neurotic. This weapon is a very ancient heritage of mankind, which lay buried in the patient and was brought to light through excavation. Analysis. The weapon has to do with insight, with wisdom. It is a means of attack and defense. Her father's weapon was a passionate, unbending will with which he made his way through life. Up till now, the patient has been the opposite in every respect. She is just on the point of realizing that a person can also will something and need not merely be driven, as she had always believed. The will based on a knowledge of life and insight is an ancient heritage of the human race, which also is in her. But till now lay buried, for in this respect too, she is her father's daughter. But she had not appreciated this till now, because her character had been that of a perpetually whining, pampered, spoilt child. She was extremely passive and completely given to sexual fantasies. Interpretation of dream. We must now make clear what is required to produce the transcendent function. First and foremost, we need the unconscious material. The most readily accessible expression of unconscious processes is undoubtedly dreams. The dream is, so to speak, a pure product of the unconscious. The alterations that the dream undergoes in the process of reaching consciousness, although undeniable, can be considered irrelevant, since they too derive from the unconscious and are not intentional distortions. Possible modifications of the original dream image derive from a more superficial layer of the unconscious, and therefore contain valuable material too. They are further fantasy products, following the general trend of the dream. The same applies to the subsequent images and ideas that frequently occur while dozing or rise spontaneously on waking. Since the dream originates in sleep, it bears all the characteristics of an abaissement du niveau mental, Janet, or of low energy tension, logical discontinuity, fragmentary character, analogy formations, superficial associations of the verbal, clang or visual type, condensations, irrational expressions, confusion, etc. With an increase of energy tension, the dreams acquire a more ordered character. They become dramatically composed and reveal clear sense connections, and the valency of the associations increases. Since the energy tension in sleep is usually very low, dreams, compared with conscious material, are inferior expressions of unconscious contents and are very difficult to understand from a constructive point of view, but are usually easier to understand reductively. In general, dreams are unsuitable or difficult to make use of in developing the transcendent function, because they make too great demands on the subject. We must therefore look to other sources for the unconscious material. There are, for instance, unconscious interferences in the waking state, ideas out of the blue, slips, deceptions and lapses of memory, symptomatic actions, etc. This material is generally more useful for the reductive method than for the constructive one. It is too fragmentary and lacks continuity, which is indispensable for a meaningful synthesis. Another source is spontaneous fantasies. They usually have a more composed and coherent character, and often contain much that is obviously significant. Some patients are able to produce fantasies at any time, allowing them to rise freely simply by eliminating critical attention. Such fantasies can be used, though this particular talent is none too common. The capacity to produce free fantasies can, however, be developed with practice. The training consists first of all in systematic exercises for eliminating critical attention, thus producing a vacuum in consciousness. This encourages the emergence of any fantasies that are lying in readiness. A prerequisite, of course, is that fantasies with a high libido charge are actually lying ready. This is naturally not always the case. Where this is not so, special measures are required. Before entering upon a discussion of these, I must yield to an uncomfortable feeling which tells me that the reader may be asking dubiously, what really is the point of all this? And why is it so absolutely necessary to bring up the unconscious contents? Is it not sufficient if from time to time they come up of their own accord and make themselves unpleasantly felt? Does one have to drag the unconscious to the surface by force? On the contrary, should it not be the job of analysis to empty the unconscious of fantasies and in this way render it ineffective? It may be as well to consider these misgivings in somewhat more detail, since the methods for bringing the unconscious to consciousness may strike the reader as novel, unusual, and perhaps even rather weird. We must therefore first discuss these natural objections, so that they shall not hold us up when we begin demonstrating the methods in question. As we have seen, we need the unconscious contents to supplement the conscious attitude. If the conscious attitude were only to a slight degree directed, the unconscious could flow in quite of its own accord. This is what does in fact happen with all those people who have a low level of conscious tension, for instance, primitives. Among primitives, no special measures are required to bring up the unconscious. Nowhere, really, are special measures required for this, because those people who are least aware of their unconscious side are the most influenced by it. But they are unconscious of what is happening. The secret participation of the unconscious is everywhere present without our having to search for it. But as it remains unconscious, we never really know what is going on or what to expect. What we are searching for is a way to make conscious those contents that are about to influence our actions, so that the secret interference of the unconscious and its unpleasant consequences can be avoided. The reader will no doubt ask, why cannot the unconscious be left to its own devices? Those who have not already had a few bad experiences in this respect will naturally see no reason to control the unconscious. But anyone with a sufficiently bad experience will eagerly welcome the bare possibility of doing so. Directedness is absolutely necessary for the conscious process, but as we have seen, it entails an unavoidable one-sidedness. Since the psyche is a self-regulating system, just as the body is, the regulating counteraction will always develop in the unconscious. Were it not for the directedness of the conscious function, the counteracting influences of the unconscious could set in unhindered. It is just this directedness that excludes them. This, of course, does not inhibit the counteraction, which goes on despite everything. Its regulating influence, however, is eliminated by critical attention and the directed will, because the counteraction as such seems incompatible with the conscious direction. To this extent, the psyche of civilized man is no longer a self-regulating system, but could rather be compared to a machine whose speed regulation is so insensitive that it can continue to function to the point of self-injury. While on the other hand, it is subject to the arbitrary manipulations of a one-sided will. Now it is a peculiarity of psychic functioning that when the unconscious counteraction is suppressed, it loses its regulating influence. It then begins to have an accelerating and intensifying effect on the conscious process. It is as though the counteraction had lost its regulating influence and hence its energy altogether, for a condition then arises in which not only no inhibiting counteraction takes place, but in which its energy seems to add itself to that of the conscious direction. To begin with, this naturally facilitates the execution of the conscious intentions, but because they are unchecked, they may easily assert themselves at the cost of the whole. For instance, when someone makes a rather bold assertion and suppresses the counteraction, namely a well-placed doubt, he will insist on it all the more to his own detriment. The ease with which the counteraction can be eliminated is proportional to the degree of dissociability of the psyche and leads to loss of instinct. This is characteristic of, as well as very necessary for civilized man, since instincts in their original strength can render social adaptation almost impossible. It is not a real atrophy of instinct, but in most cases, only a relatively lasting product of education, and would never have struck such deep roots had it not served the interests of the individual. Apart from the everyday cases met with in practice, a good example of the suppression of the unconscious regulating influence can be found in Nietzsche's Zarathustra. The discovery of the higher man, and also of the ugliest man, expresses the regulating influence. For the higher men want to drag Zarathustra down to the collective sphere of average humanity as it always has been, while the ugliest man is actually the personification of the counteraction. But the roaring lion of Zarathustra's moral conviction forces all these influences, above all the feeling of pity, back again into the cave of the unconscious. Thus the regulating influence is suppressed, but not the secret counteraction of the unconscious, which from now on becomes clearly noticeable in Nietzsche's writings. First, he seeks his adversary in Wagner, whom he cannot forgive for Parsifal. But soon his whole wrath turns against Christianity, and in particular against St. Paul, who in some ways suffered a fate similar to Nietzsche's. As is well known, Nietzsche's psychosis first produced an identification with the crucified Christ, and then with the dismembered Dionysus. With this catastrophe, the counteraction at last broke through to the surface. Another example is the classic case of megalomania preserved for us in the 4th chapter of the book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar, at the height of his power, had a dream which foretold disaster if he did not humble himself. Daniel interpreted the dream quite expertly, but without getting a hearing. Subsequent events showed that his interpretation was correct, for Nebuchadnezzar, after suppressing the unconscious regulating influence, fell victim to a psychosis that contained the very counteraction he had sought to escape. He, the Lord of the earth, was degraded to an animal. An acquaintance of mine once told me a dream in which he stepped out into space from the top of a mountain. I explained to him something of the influence of the unconscious and warned him against dangerous mountaineering expeditions for which he had a regular passion. But he laughed at such ideas. A few months later, while climbing a mountain, he actually did step off into space and was killed. Anyone who has seen these things happen over and over again in every conceivable shade of dramatic intensity is bound to ponder. He becomes aware of how easy it is to overlook the regulating influences, and that he should endeavor to pay attention to the unconscious regulation, which is so necessary for our mental and physical health. Accordingly, he will try to help himself by practicing self-observation and self-criticism. But mere self-observation and intellectual self-analysis are entirely inadequate as a means to establishing contact with the unconscious. Although no human being can be spared bad experiences, everyone shrinks from risking them, especially if he sees any way by which they might be circumvented. Knowledge of the regulating influences of the unconscious offers just such a possibility and actually does render many bad experiences unnecessary. We can avoid a great many detours that are distinguished by no particular attraction, but only by tiresome conflicts. It is bad enough to make detours and painful mistakes in unknown and unexplored territory. But to get lost in an inhabited country on broad highways is merely exasperating. What then are the means at our disposal to obtain knowledge of the regulating factors? If there is no capacity to produce fantasies freely, we have to resort to artificial aid. The reason for invoking such aid is generally a depressed or disturbed state of mind, for which no adequate cause can be found. Naturally, the patient can give any number of rationalistic reasons. The bad weather alone suffices as a reason. But none of them is really satisfying as an explanation. For a causal explanation of these states is usually satisfying only to an outsider, and then only up to a point. The outsider is content if his causal requirements are more or less satisfied. It is sufficient for him to know where the thing comes from. He does not feel the challenge which, for the patient, lies in the depression. The patient would like to know what it is all for and how to gain relief. In the intensity of the emotional disturbance itself lies the value, the energy that he should have at his disposal in order to remedy the state of reduced adaptation. Nothing is achieved by repressing this state or devaluing it rationally. In order, therefore, to gain possession of the energy that is in the wrong place, he must make the emotional state the basis or starting point of the procedure. He must make himself as conscious as possible of the mood he is in, sinking himself in it without reserve, and noting down on paper all the fantasies and other associations that come up. Fantasy must be allowed the freest possible play, yet not in such a manner that it leaves the orbit of its object, namely the affect, by setting off a kind of chain reaction association process. This free association, as Freud called it, leads away from the object to all sorts of complexes, and one can never be sure that they relate to the affect and are not displacements that have appeared in its stead. Out of this preoccupation with the object, there comes a more or less complete expression of the mood, which reproduces the content of the depression in some way, either concretely or symbolically. Since the depression was not manufactured by the conscious mind, but is an unwelcome intrusion from the unconscious, the elaboration of the mood is, as it were, a picture of the contents and tendencies of the unconscious that were massed together in the depression. The whole procedure is a kind of enrichment and clarification of the affect, whereby the affect and its contents are brought nearer to consciousness, becoming at the same time more impressive and more understandable. This work by itself can have a favorable and vitalizing influence. At all events, it creates a new situation, since the previously unrelated affect has become a more or less clear and articulate idea thanks to the assistance and cooperation of the conscious mind. This is the beginning of the transcendent function, that is, of the collaboration of conscious and unconscious data. The emotional disturbance can also be dealt with in another way, not by clarifying it intellectually, but by giving it a visible shape. Patients who possess some talent for drawing or painting can give expression to their mood by means of a picture. The picture doesn't have to be technically or aesthetically satisfying, but merely for the fantasy to have free play, and for the whole thing to be done as well as possible. In principle, this procedure agrees with the one first described. Here too, a product is created which is influenced by both conscious and unconscious, embodying the striving of the unconscious for the light and the striving of the conscious for substance. Often, however, we find cases where there is no tangible mood or depression at all, but just a general dull discontent, a feeling of resistance to everything, a sort of boredom or vague disgust, an indefinable but excruciating emptiness. In these cases, no definite starting point exists. It would first have to be created. Here, a special introversion of libido is necessary, supported perhaps by favorable external conditions such as complete rest, especially at night, when the libido has in any case a tendency to introversion. "'Tis night, now do all fountains speak louder, and my soul also is a bubbling fountain." Critical attention must be eliminated. Visual types should concentrate on the expectation that an inner image will be produced. As a rule, such a fantasy picture will actually appear, perhaps hypnagogically, and should be carefully observed and noted down in writing. Audio-verbal types usually hear inner words, perhaps mere fragments of apparently meaningless sentences to begin with, which, however, should be carefully noted down too. Others at such times simply hear their other voice. There are indeed not a few people who are well aware that they possess a sort of inner critic or judge who immediately comments on everything they say or do. Insane people hear this voice directly as auditory hallucinations. But normal people too, if their inner life is fairly well developed, are able to reproduce this inaudible voice without difficulty, though as it is notoriously irritating and refractory, it is almost always repressed. Such persons have little difficulty in procuring the unconscious material and thus laying the foundation of the transcendent function. There are others again who neither see nor hear anything inside themselves, but whose hands have the knack of giving expression to the contents of the unconscious. Such people can profitably work with plastic materials. Those who are able to express the unconscious by means of bodily movements are rather rare. The disadvantage that movements cannot easily be fixed in the mind must be met by making careful drawings of the movements afterward, so that they shall not be lost to the memory. Still rarer, but equally valuable, is automatic writing, direct or with the planchette. This too yields useful results. We now come to the next question. What is to be done with the material obtained in one of the manners described? To this question there is no a priori answer. It is only when the conscious mind confronts the products of the unconscious that a provisional reaction will ensue, which determines the subsequent procedure. Practical experience alone can give us a clue. So far as my experience goes, there appear to be two main tendencies. One is the way of creative formulation, and the other is the way of understanding. Where the principle of creative formulation predominates, the material is continually varied and increased until a kind of condensation of motifs into more or less stereotyped symbols takes place. These stimulate the creative fantasy and serve chiefly as aesthetic motifs. This tendency leads to the aesthetic problem of artistic formulation. Where, on the other hand, the principle of understanding predominates, the aesthetic aspect is of relatively little interest and may occasionally even be felt as a hindrance. Instead, there is an intensive struggle to understand the meaning of the unconscious product. Whereas aesthetic formulation tends to concentrate on the formal aspect of the motif, an intuitive understanding often tries to catch the meaning from barely adequate hints in the material, without considering those elements which would come to light in a more careful formulation. Neither of these tendencies can be brought about by an arbitrary effort of will. They are far more the result of the peculiar makeup of the individual personality. Both have their typical dangers and may lead one astray. The danger of the aesthetic tendency is an overvaluation of the formal or artistic worth of the fantasy productions. The libido is diverted from the real goal of the transcendent function and sidetracked into purely aesthetic problems of artistic expression. The danger of wanting to understand the meaning is an overvaluation of the content, which is subjected to intellectual analysis and interpretation, so that the essentially symbolic character of the product is lost. Up to a point, these bypaths must be followed in order to satisfy aesthetic or intellectual requirements, whichever predominates in the individual case. But the danger of both these bypaths is worth stressing, for after a certain point of psychic development has been reached, the products of the unconscious are greatly overvalued precisely because they were boundlessly undervalued before. This undervaluation is one of the greatest obstacles in formulating the unconscious material. It reveals the collective standards by which anything individual is judged. Nothing is considered good or beautiful that does not fit into the collective schema, though it is true that contemporary art is beginning to make compensatory efforts in this respect. What is lacking is not the collective recognition of the individual product, but its subjective appreciation, the understanding of its meaning and value for the subject. This feeling of inferiority for one's own product is of course not the rule everywhere. Sometimes we find the exact opposite, a naive and uncritical overvaluation coupled with the demand for collective recognition once the initial feeling of inferiority has been overcome. Conversely, an initial overvaluation can easily turn into depreciatory skepticism. These erroneous judgments are due to the individual's unconsciousness and lack of self-reliance. Either he is able to judge only by collective standards, or else, owing to ego inflation, he loses his capacity for judgment altogether. One tendency seems to be the regulating principle of the other. Both are bound together in a compensatory relationship. Experience bears out this formula, so far as it is possible at this stage to draw more general conclusions. We could say that aesthetic formulation needs an understanding of the meaning, and understanding needs aesthetic formulation. The two supplement each other to form the transcendent function. The first steps along both paths follow the same principle. Consciousness puts its media of expression at the disposal of the unconscious content. It must not do more than this at first, so as not to exert undue influence. In giving the content form, the lead must be left as far as possible to the chance ideas and associations thrown up by the unconscious. This is naturally something of a setback from the conscious standpoint and is often felt as painful. It is not difficult to understand this when we remember how the contents of the unconscious usually present themselves, as things that are too weak by nature to cross the threshold, or as incompatible elements that were repressed for a variety of reasons. Mostly they are unwelcome, unexpected, irrational contents, disregard or repression of which seems altogether understandable. Only a small part of them has any unusual value, either from the collective or from the subjective standpoint. However, contents that are collectively valueless may be exceedingly valuable when seen from the standpoint of the individual. This fact expresses itself in their affective tone, no matter whether the subject feels it as negative or positive. Society, too, is divided in its acceptance of new and unknown ideas which obtrude their emotionality. The purpose of the initial procedure is to discover the feeling-toned contents, for in these cases we are always dealing with situations where the one-sidedness of consciousness meets with the resistance of the instinctual sphere. The two ways do not divide until the aesthetic problem becomes decisive for one type of person and the intellectual moral problem for the other. The ideal case would be if these two aspects could exist side by side or rhythmically succeed each other. That is, if there were an alternation of creation and understanding. It hardly seems possible for one to exist without the other, though it sometimes does happen in practice. The creative urge seizes possession of the object at the cost of its meaning, or the urge to understand overrides the necessity of giving it form. The unconscious contents want first of all to be seen clearly, which can only be done by giving them shape, and to be judged only when everything they have to say is tangibly present. It was for this reason that Freud got the dream contents, as it were, to express themselves in the form of free associations, before he began interpreting them. It does not suffice in all cases to elucidate only the conceptual context of a dream content. Often it is necessary to clarify a vague content by giving it a visible form. This can be done by drawing, painting, or modeling. Often the hands know how to solve a riddle with which the intellect has wrestled in vain. By shaping it, one goes on dreaming the dream in greater detail in the waking state, and the initially incomprehensible, isolated event is integrated into the sphere of the total personality, even though it remains at first unconscious to the subject. Aesthetic formulation leaves it at that, and gives up any idea of discovering a meaning. This sometimes leads patients to fancy themselves artists, misunderstood ones naturally. The desire to understand, if it dispenses with careful formulation, starts with the chance idea or association, and therefore lacks an adequate basis. It has better prospects of success if it begins only with the formulated product. The less the initial material is shaped and developed, the greater is the danger that understanding will be governed not by empirical facts, but by theoretical and moral considerations. The kind of understanding with which we are concerned at this stage consists in a reconstruction of the meaning that seems to be immanent in the original chance idea. It is evident that such a procedure can legitimately take place only when there is a sufficient motive for it. Equally, the lead can be left to the unconscious only if it already contains the will to lead. This naturally happens only when the conscious mind finds itself in a critical situation. Once the unconscious content has been given form and the meaning of the formulation is understood, the question arises as to how the ego will relate to this position, and how the ego and the unconscious are to come to terms. This is the second and more important stage of the procedure, the bringing together of opposites for the production of a third, the transcendent function. At this stage, it is no longer the unconscious that takes the lead, but the ego. We shall not define the individual ego here, but shall leave it in its banal reality as that continuous center of consciousness, whose presence has made itself felt since the days of childhood. It is confronted with a psychic product that owes its existence mainly to an unconscious process, and is therefore in some degree opposed to the ego and its tendencies. This standpoint is essential in coming to terms with the unconscious. The position of the ego must be maintained as being of equal value to the counterposition of the unconscious, and vice versa. This amounts to a very necessary warning, for just as the conscious mind of civilized man has a restrictive effect on the unconscious, so the rediscovered unconscious often has a really dangerous effect on the ego. In the same way that the ego suppressed the unconscious before, a liberated unconscious can thrust the ego aside and overwhelm it. There is a danger of the ego losing its head, so to speak, that it will not be able to defend itself against the pressure of affective factors, a situation often encountered at the beginning of schizophrenia. This danger would not exist, or would not be so acute, if the process of having it out with the unconscious could somehow divest the affects of their dynamism. And this is what does in fact happen when the counterposition is aestheticized or intellectualized. But the confrontation with the unconscious must be a many-sided one, for the transcendent function is not a partial process running a conditioned course. It is a total and integral event in which all aspects are or should be included. The affect must therefore be deployed at its full strength. Aestheticization and intellectualization are excellent weapons against dangerous affects, but they should be used only when there is a vital threat and not to avoid a necessary task. Thanks to the fundamental insight of Freud, we know that emotional factors must be given full consideration in the treatment of the neuroses. The personality as a whole must be taken seriously into account, and this applies to both parties, the patient as well as the analyst. How far the latter may hide behind the shield of theory remains a delicate question, to be left to his discretion. At all events, the treatment of neurosis is not a kind of psychological water cure, but a renewal of the personality, working in every direction and penetrating every sphere of life. Coming to terms with the counterposition is a serious matter on which sometimes a very great deal depends. Taking the other side seriously is an essential prerequisite of the process, for only in that way can the regulating factors exert an influence on our actions. Taking it seriously does not mean taking it literally, but it does mean giving the unconscious credit so that it has a chance to cooperate with consciousness instead of automatically disturbing it. Thus, in coming to terms with the unconscious, not only is the standpoint of the ego justified, but the unconscious is granted the same authority. The ego takes the lead, but the unconscious must be allowed to have its say too. Audiatur et altera pars. The way this can be done is best shown by those cases in which the other voice is more or less distinctly heard. For such people, it is technically very simple to note down the other voice in writing and to answer its statements from the standpoint of the ego. It is exactly as if a dialogue were taking place between two human beings with equal rights, each of whom gives the other credit for a valid argument and considers it worthwhile to modify the conflicting standpoints by means of thorough comparison and discussion, or else to distinguish them clearly from one another. Since the way to agreement seldom stands open, in most cases a long conflict will have to be borne, demanding sacrifices from both sides. Such a rapprochement could just as well take place between patient and analyst, the role of devil's advocate easily falling to the latter. The present day shows with appalling clarity how little able people are to let the other man's argument count, although this capacity is a fundamental and indispensable condition for any human community. Everyone who proposes to come to terms with himself must reckon with this basic problem. For, to the degree that he does not admit the validity of the other person, he denies the other within himself the right to exist, and vice versa. The capacity for inner dialogue is a touchstone for outer objectivity. Simple as the process of coming to terms may be in the case of the inner dialogue, it is undoubtedly more complicated in other cases where only visual products are available, speaking a language that is eloquent enough for one who understands it, but which seems like deaf and dumb language to one who does not. Faced with such products, the ego must seize the initiative and ask, how am I affected by this sign? This Faustian question can call forth an illuminating answer. The more direct and natural the answer is, the more valuable it will be, for directness and naturalness guarantee a more or less total reaction. It is not absolutely necessary for the process of confrontation itself to become conscious in every detail. Very often a total reaction does not have at its disposal those theoretical assumptions, views and concepts that would make clear apprehension possible. In such cases, one must be content with the wordless but suggestive feelings that appear in their stead and are more valuable than clever talk. The shuttling to and fro of arguments and effects represents the transcendent function of opposites. The confrontation of the two positions generates a tension charged with energy and creates a living third thing. Not a logical stillbirth in accordance with the principle tertium non datur, but a movement out of the suspension between opposites. A living birth that leads to a new level of being, a new situation. The transcendent function manifests itself as a quality of conjoined opposites. So long as these are kept apart, naturally to avoid conflict, they do not function and remain inert. In whatever form the opposites appear in the individual, at the bottom, it is always a matter of consciousness lost and obstinately stuck in one-sidedness, confronted with the image of instinctive wholeness and freedom. This presents a picture of the anthropoid and archaic man with, on the one hand, his supposedly uninhibited world of instinct, and on the other, his often misunderstood world of spiritual ideas who, compensating and correcting our one-sidedness, emerges from the darkness and shows us how and where we have deviated from the basic pattern and crippled ourselves psychically. I must content myself here with a description of the outward forms and possibilities of the transcendent function. Another task of greater importance would be the description of its contents. There is already a mass of material on this subject, but not all the difficulties in the way of exposition have yet been overcome. Some preparatory studies are still needed before the conceptual foundation is laid, which would enable us to give a clear and intelligible account of the contents of the transcendent function. I have unfortunately had the experience that the scientific public is not everywhere in a position to follow a purely psychological argument, since they either take it too personally or are bedeviled by philosophical or intellectual prejudices. This renders any meaningful appreciation of the psychological factors quite impossible. If people take it personally, their judgment is always subjective, and they declare everything to be impossible which seems not to apply in their case, or which they prefer not to acknowledge. They are quite incapable of realizing that what is valid for them may not be valid at all for another person with a different psychology. We are still very far from possessing a general valid scheme of explanation in all cases. One of the greatest obstacles to psychological understanding is the inquisitive desire to know whether the psychological factor adduced is true or correct. If the description of it is not erroneous or false, then the factor is valid in itself and proves its validity by its very existence. One might just as well ask if the duck-billed platypus is a true or correct invention of the Creator's will. Equally childish is the prejudice against the role that mythological assumptions play in the life of the psyche. Since they are not true, it is argued that they have no place in a scientific explanation. But mythologisms exist, even though their statements do not coincide with our incommensurable idea of truth. As the process of coming to terms with the counterposition has a total character, nothing is excluded. Everything takes part in the discussion, even if only fragments become conscious. Consciousness is continually widened through the confrontation with previously unconscious contents, or, to be more accurate, could be widened if it took the trouble to integrate them. That is naturally not always the case. Even if there is sufficient intelligence to understand the procedure, there may yet be a lack of courage and self-confidence, or one is too lazy, mentally and morally, or too cowardly to make an effort. But where the necessary premises exist, the transcendent function not only forms a valuable addition to psychotherapeutic treatment, but gives the patient the inestimable advantage of assisting the analyst on his own resources and of breaking a dependence which is often felt as humiliating. It is a way of attaining liberation by one's own efforts and of finding the courage to be oneself.